30 feet wide, perfectly straight, and it ends at the edge of a cliff. Not a path, not a trail. A road engineered, deliberate, and inexplicable by any practical logic we understand. 400 miles of it, crossing desert, climbing mesa walls, connecting 30 communities across the American Southwest. Built without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools. 800 years before the first European arrived. And the people whose ancestors built it never lost the memory of why. Pull up a satellite image of the San Juan Basin in northwestern New Mexico. The terrain looks chaotic. Broken mesas, dry washes, red rock ridgelines running in every direction. And then you notice them. Faint parallel lines, crossing the desert at angles too deliberate for geology. Too wide for animal trails. Too straight for anything a wagon wheel ever made. What you are looking at is the Chacoan road system, one of the most sophisticated, pre-Columbian engineering projects on this continent. It was built by the ancestral Puebloans, the people whose direct descendants are the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the 19 Pueblo nations of New Mexico. And its center, its hub, its organizing principle, was a single canyon in the high desert of what is now New Mexico. Chaco Canyon. In the year 1050, this was the most architecturally complex place in North America. We know about the great houses, multi-story stone buildings, some containing hundreds of rooms, oriented to astronomical events with precision that still astonishes researchers. Those are the things other videos cover. What this video is about is the roads. Specifically, one detail inside the road system that changes everything about how you understand what was built here. To get to that detail, you need to understand the scale of what surrounded it. The documented road network covers approximately 400 miles of surveyed segments. 400 miles, roughly the driving distance from Chicago to Detroit. Except crossing canyon desert, with no wheels and no animals to pull anything. Those roads connect Chaco Canyon to at least 30 outlier great house communities spread across a geographic footprint roughly the size of Ohio. 30 communities, think of 30 regional airports, all networked to a single hub city. Except the hub was not a commercial center. It was a ceremonial one. Construction on this network began around 850 CE, when Charlemagne's empire was already a generation old in Europe, when the First Crusade was still 200 years in the future. By 1050, the year this story peaks, the road system had been under continuous construction and maintenance for 200 years. It would continue for another 100 years after that, 300 years total, longer than the United States has existed as a nation. That institutional continuity is itself remarkable. But it is not the detail. The detail is this: the roads are straight, not approximately straight, not mostly straight. Straight in a way that defeats common sense, defeats practical logic, and defeats every assumption about what pre-Columbian infrastructure looked like. And the proof is buried inside one specific road segment, one specific cliff face, and one specific engineering decision that tells you everything. In 1978, researchers examining early Landsat satellite imagery noticed something strange in the New Mexico desert. Parallel lines, consistent width, running across the landscape at bearings too precise for erosion, too purposeful for chance. They were not looking for roads. They did not expect roads. What they expected, in the high desert of the San Juan Basin, was the usual record of human movement: winding, terrain following, practical. Every road ever built bends around mountains. Every road adjusts to the landscape it crosses. That is what roads do. Except these. These did not bend. The Landsat data revealed segments running in straight lines across terrain that should have made straight lines impossible. Mesas, ridgelines, broken rock, dry canyon cuts, none of it deflected the bearing by more than fractions of a degree. The researchers were looking at infrastructure 850 years old that had been hiding in plain sight, visible only once humans climbed high enough above it to see the full shape. Follow-up ground surveys confirmed what the imagery suggested. The roads were real, physical, built. By D, they averaged 30 feet in width, wider than a standard American highway lane, wider than a two-lane road today, wide enough to march a procession 20 people across. The surfaces had been cleared and graded. Low earthen berms ran along both sides. In some sections, masonry curbing defined the edges like a formal avenue. These were not paths worn by repeated foot traffic. These were constructed corridors, that bordering earthen berms on both sides. Masonry, curbing in places, is a design feature archaeologist Fred Niles and his colleagues documented in the Bureau of Land Management's 1987 survey. Niles noted that this bordering made the roads look less like trade infrastructure and more like ceremonial avenues. Think of the processional avenues at ancient Thebes in Egypt, or the formal corridors at Persepolis in Persia. Wide, bounded, built to be walked with intention. That is the kind of architecture the Chacoan roads belong to. Not supply lines, processional corridors. But the berm detail, as striking as it is still not the hidden detail. The hidden detail requires you to stand at a specific location and look down. Here is where the 2015 LiDAR survey becomes essential. LiDAR light detection and ranging fires laser pulses from aircraft and maps the ground surface with millimeter precision through vegetation and debris. When University of New Mexico researchers published LiDAR data covering the Chacoan road corridors in 2015, they confirmed something earlier ground surveys had reported, but not fully mapped. Multiple road segments end at cliff edges, not near cliff edges, at cliff edges. No turn. No switchback. No alternative descent path cut below the drop. The road runs straight, at full 30-foot width, maintained and bordered all the way to the edge. And then there is nothing below it but open air and a sandstone drop. Archaeologist John Roney, who has spent decades studying the Chacoan road system, documents this pattern and interprets it directly. The destination, not the route efficiency, was the organizing principle of these roads. The cliff edge was not an obstacle. It was the point. Picture the survey crews in the 1970s following a road segment on foot across open desert, measuring, documenting, recording the bearing, walking the 30-foot wide corridor, the berms on both sides, the graded surface underfoot, and then watching the road walk straight to the edge of a sandstone mesa and stop. No deviation, no ramp, just the edge, and the road ending at it, as though the builder always knew the cliff was there and built toward it anyway. Because the builder did know. That is the point this video keeps returning to. The ancestral Puebloans were not accidentally building roads to cliff edges. They were intentionally building roads to cliff edges. And the reason reveals itself when you look at what happened when the road encountered a ridge. Not just an edge. When a Chacoan road met a mesa wall, a vertical face of sandstone, not just a drop, but an actual barrier, the engineers did not search for a way around it. They cut stairs into the bedrock, not narrow steps for a single person picking their way up. Wide stairs, processional stairs, in some cases carved to match the full width of the road corridor. The labor required to cut those stairs through sandstone with stone tools is difficult to calculate, and almost impossible to justify on purely logistical grounds. If the goal was moving goods across the landscape efficiently, you find the pass. You find the natural ramp. Every practical road builder in history has done exactly that. Instead, the ancestral Puebloans carved stairs into a cliff face, continued the road at exactly the same compass bearing on the other side, and maintained that bearing for miles beyond. The straightness was not incidental. The straightness was the requirement. And understanding why requires confronting the most studied single segment in the entire network. But what the Great North Road reveals about that requirement, nobody teaches this part. The Great North Road is the most documented segment of the Chacoan system, and its statistics are worth sitting with for a moment. It runs approximately 35 miles due north from Chaco Canyon toward the community now known as Aztec Ruins. 35 miles, roughly the distance from downtown Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, run in a line so straight it deviates less than 1 degree over the entire length. Thomas Windez, whose documentation through the Chaco Research Archive is among the most thorough available, confirmed this directional precision through systematic survey. Less than 1 degree of deviation over 35 miles of canyon desert, through terrain that defeated later colonial-era road builders consistently. Spanish colonial expeditions entering this region in the late 1500s did not build straight roads here. They could not. The terrain does not permit it unless straightness is an absolute priority you will pay any cost to maintain. The ancestral Puebloans paid that cost. In stone-cut stairs, in labor, in decades of maintenance, for 300 years. Now consider what the Great North Road was connecting. It runs north from Chaco Canyon, the ceremonial hub toward Salmon ruins and Aztec ruins, both major outlier communities in the Chacoan network. But it does not only connect 2 points. It runs due north, a cardinal direction at a bearing that carries cosmological significance in Pueblo tradition. Stephen Lexon, whose research on what he calls the Chaco Meridian is among the most influential in this field, documents that at least 8 independent road segments radiate from Chaco Canyon in cardinal and intercardinal directions. Not the most convenient directions. Not the directions that minimize distance to the outlier communities. Cardinal directions. The directions the cosmos organizes itself around. Imagine if the builders of the U.S. interstate highway system had decided every highway must run in a perfectly straight line from origin to destination. And then wherever a mountain stood in the way, instead of routing around it, they blasted a perfectly straight corridor through it. That is what the ancestral Puebloans did, except with stone tools. 800 years before the first European set foot in this desert, the cosmological orientation of the road system, cardinal directions, straight lines, cliff terminations, places this infrastructure in a category that archaeology has historically underfunded and undernamed. It is not trade infrastructure. It is not military infrastructure. It is pilgrimage infrastructure. And that distinction is not modern academic interpretation. It comes directly from the people whose ancestors built these roads. They have always known what the roads were for. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblo nations maintain oral histories describing Chaco as a place of origin and pilgrimage. Not an abandoned site, not a mystery, a destination one that their ancestors walked toward along paths whose orientation was a statement about the relationship between the human world and the cosmic one. The oral histories corroborate the archaeology. The archaeology corroborates the oral histories. These 2 bodies of evidence have been pointing at the same conclusion for decades. The conversation about what the Chacoan roads were for has been available for decades. It simply required asking the right people. Here is where we stand. 300 years of construction, 400 miles of roads, 30 outlier communities, all networked to one canyon. The roads are straight. The straightness is intentional. The cliff terminations are intentional. The cardinal orientations are intentional. What remains to be understood is not the engineering. The engineering is documented. What remains is the question of scale. What does it mean to build a cosmology into the landscape itself? And how big did that cosmology become? Because in the year 1100, this road network was the infrastructure of a system whose geographic influence exceeded that of contemporary London. The 30 outlier great houses connected to Chaco were not independent communities loosely affiliated with the canyon. They were nodes in a network planned, constructed, and road connected. Each outlier great house typically includes its own architecture, designed to align with Chaco's astronomical orientations. Each sits along a road segment that points back toward the canyon. The road system did not just connect these places physically, it organized them cosmologically. And the roads themselves were carrying something more than foot traffic. They were carrying meaning. A 30-foot-wide processional corridor shaped how visitors experienced the space. You are not following a path. You are following an argument, an architectural argument about the direction that matters, about the destination this journey is oriented toward. The low, earthen berms on both sides of the road formalize that argument. They define the corridor. They say, this is the way, and it runs this direction, and it does not waver. The stone curbing in certain sections says it more emphatically. This road was finished. It was maintained. It was kept. The sensory experience of walking a Chacoan road corridor has no modern American equivalent except, perhaps, walking the formal processional approach to a major monument. The dry desert air. The sound of sandstone underfoot. The berms running parallel on both sides, framing the view ahead toward a destination the walker cannot yet see. And that destination is the canyon or the cliff or the cardinal direction, all of which are the same thing understood differently. Now comes the detail inside the detail. The one that the LiDAR data revealed most sharply, and that no ground survey before it could fully capture. Multiple road segments do not merely end at cliff edges. They end at cliff edges where, below the drop, there is nothing that needs connecting. No community below, no resource extraction point, no strategic position, just the edge, and beyond the edge, the open desert. John Roney's analysis of this pattern is careful and precise. He does not overstate it. He documents the locations, maps the road terminations, and asks the plainest possible question. Why build a maintained, bordered, 30-foot wide processional corridor to an edge that leads nowhere? The answer archaeology has converged on, because the edge was the destination. In many indigenous cosmologies of the Southwest, edges, mesa edges, canyon rims, the points where the human landscape meets the void carry sacred significance. They are thresholds, the points where one world meets another. Building a road to a threshold, maintaining it over generations, walking it during ceremony, this is not irrational. This is architecture serving a function that practical infrastructure cannot serve. It is the same logic that built the great processional avenues of ancient Egypt toward temples that could only be entered by specific people on specific days. The road's purpose was the walking of the road. The destination confirmed the meaning of the journey. And here is where the numbers come back, because the numbers are what ground this in reality. 300 years, 850 CE to 1150 CE. That is the construction and maintenance window the archaeological record supports. 300 years of institutional commitment to keeping these roads clear, bordered, straight, and aligned. 300 years of surveying crews, using sighting poles, using human vision, using methods that left no written record, but left physical results that survived 9 centuries. 300 years of stone-cut stairways maintained on cliff faces. 300 years of berm repair after desert storms. 300 years of processional roads that never acquired a wheel rut. Because there were no wheels. Because there were no draft animals. Every cubic foot of earth moved in those berms was carried by hand. Every stair cut into every cliff face was cut by a person holding a stone tool. And yet the bearing of the Great North Road deviates less than 1 degree over 35 miles. Let that number land. Less than 1 degree. Over terrain that colonial-era engineers, with iron tools and surveying instruments, consistently bent around. And here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore, because the roads were never lost. Only the question was. In the 1990s, the National Park Service convened formal consultation meetings with representatives of the 19 Pueblo nations of New Mexico. The consultation was required by federal historic preservation law, the kind of legal recognition that acknowledges tribal nations as stakeholders in the interpretation of their own ancestral landscapes. The topic was Chaco. The topic, inevitably, became the roads. And what the Pueblo scholars said in those consultations reframed the entire history of Chacoan archaeology with a single clarification. The roads were not mysterious. They had never been mysterious. The oral histories of the Pueblo nations had always described them. Rina Swincell, an architectural historian and scholar from Santa Clara, Pueblo, put it plainly in an interview for the documentary The Mystery of Chaco Canyon. The roads connect us to our ancestors. We have always known they were there. We have stories about walking those roads. The roads were never lost. They were not lost to the Hopi, not lost to the Zuni, not lost to Acoma, not lost to any of the 19 pueblos of New Mexico. The roads were lost only to the people who did not ask, the people who knew. That is not a minor footnote in the history of Chacoan archaeology. That is the central methodological failure of a century of research. For decades, Western researchers treated the Chacoan road system as a puzzle evidence without explanation, engineering without apparent purpose. The explanation existed the entire time. In oral histories maintained across generations, across the relocation from Chaco Canyon northward after 1130, across the centuries that followed, the ancestral Puebloans did not vanish from Chaco Canyon. This is one of the most important corrections in the entire history of this site, and it still does not appear in most public education about it. Beginning around 1130, a severe multi-decade drought, documented precisely in tree ring data, began stressing the Chacoan system. By approximately 1150, construction at Chaco Canyon effectively ceased. The population dispersed northward, toward communities including Aztec ruins and eventually Mesa Verde. They relocated. They took their knowledge with them. Their descendants maintained oral traditions about Chaco as a place of origin and pilgrimage. The Spanish colonial expeditions entering this region in the late 1500s found no one at Chaco itself, because the ancestral Puebloans had already moved, not because they had disappeared. The roads outlasted the population that built them by 400 years before any European saw them, and the memory of the roads outlasted European contact by the same margin. Now consider what that oral continuity means for interpreting the road system. When Pueblo scholars describe the roads as pilgrimage paths, as sacred corridors walked during ceremony, connecting living communities to ancestral places, they are not offering a romantic interpretation. They are providing a direct transmission from the builders. The research of T.J. Ferguson and John Roney, conducted in collaboration with Pueblo nations, documents the correspondence between Pueblo oral histories and the archaeological evidence of pilgrimage road architecture. The straight roads radiating in cardinal directions from Chaco, the roads that end at cliff edges, the roads that cut stairs through ridgelines rather than bend around them. These are all features that make sense in a pilgrimage framework and in almost no other framework. A pilgrimage road is not optimized for efficiency. It is optimized for meaning. The meaning of a pilgrimage road is in its straightness, in the visual and physical argument that the destination is so important that no deviation toward convenience is acceptable. Medieval European pilgrimage, routes bent around mountains. The Camino de Santiago winds through the landscape of northern Spain, following the terrain. The Chacoan roads did not bend. They cut through the mountain instead. That difference is not a matter of different engineering capability. It is a difference in architectural philosophy. The ancestral Puebloans were encoding into the landscape a statement about the relationship between human movement and cosmic order. The road is straight, because the cosmos is not negotiated with. You walk toward it directly, and where the landscape resists, you cut the stairs. Anna Sophier's research, through the Solstice Project, documented at least 8 road segments radiating from Chaco in cardinal and intercardinal directions, consistent with the astronomical orientation that governs the great houses themselves. The road network and the architectural complex are one integrated system. The roads are not the supply lines to the buildings. The roads are the buildings extended into the landscape, organizing it cosmologically. This is the hidden detail. Not that the roads exist, not that they are old, not that they are well engineered. The hidden detail is that the deliberate straightness, the straightness that required cutting stairs through cliff faces, the straightness that ended roads at cliff edges, was a cosmological argument made in stone and earth over 300 years. That argument was understood by the people who walked those roads. It was recorded in their oral histories. It survived their relocation. It survived 4 centuries of colonial contact. And it was sitting there, in plain sight, in the satellite imagery, in 1978, waiting for someone to ask why the lines did not bend. The LiDAR data, published in 2015, added one more layer to this understanding. It confirmed previously unmapped segments. It confirmed cliff edge terminations at locations too remote for earlier ground surveys to reach. And it allowed researchers to see, for the first time, the full radiating pattern from Chaco Canyon. Roads going out in multiple directions simultaneously, like spokes from a hub, each oriented to a cardinal or intercardinal bearing. Viewed from above in LiDAR rendering, the road network around Chaco Canyon does not look like a transportation system. It looks like a diagram, a physical diagram of how the ancestral Puebloans understood their position in the cosmos at the center, with the sacred directions extending outward in all directions, marked in 30-foot wide earthen corridors across the desert floor. Why isn't this in your textbook? Because answering that question honestly requires acknowledging that the default narrative of North American history, complex civilization beginning with European arrival, is not a neutral description of the past. It is a choice a choice about which evidence to emphasize and which evidence to ask about. The Chacoan road system has been documented by federal government surveys since 1987, designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site for exactly these reasons, and interpreted by Pueblos scholars for longer than any academic publication on the subject. The information was never missing. The question was who it was being asked of. But the most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because the fight over these roads is not history. It is happening right now. In 2022, the Biden administration proposed formal designation of Chaco Canyon as the center of a cultural heritage protection zone. The designation was a direct response to decades of advocacy by the Navajo Nation, the Dene, and the Pueblo nations opposing oil and gas drilling on lands containing unexcavated road segments and outlier sites. The proposal would establish a 10-mile buffer around Chaco Culture National Historical Park, prohibiting new oil and gas leasing within that radius. The Dene Nation's response to that proposal was carefully documented. Tribal leaders pointed out that the 10-mile buffer, while a step, does not protect road segments and outlier sites that extend far beyond 10 miles from the canyon center. The road system covers a region the size of Ohio. A 10-mile buffer covers a fraction of a percent of that geography. Unexcavated road segments lie beneath ground that currently holds active oil and gas leases. Some of those segments have already been damaged by infrastructure associated with extraction operations. The fight over Chaco is not about an ancient past that ended when the population relocated in 1150. It is about living landscape that the Pueblo nations and the Dene have maintained legal and cultural relationships with through federally recognized consultation processes. The tribal consultation requirements embedded in federal historic preservation law are themselves a recognition that this story has living stakeholders. The Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, and the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico are not asked to consult because they are interesting. They are asked to consult because the law recognizes that their oral histories constitute a form of historical knowledge with legal standing. That recognition was hard-won. It came through decades of advocacy by tribal nations asserting that their relationship to places like Chaco was ongoing, not historical. And it came, in part, through the archaeological evidence of the road system itself. Evidence so clearly organized around ceremonial and pilgrimage function that dismissing the Pueblo oral histories about those functions became scientifically untenable. There is a direct line from the LiDAR data showing a road that ends at a cliff edge to the Dene Nation's testimony before Congress about buffer zone boundaries. Both are arguments about what Chaco was, and therefore about what it deserves to be protected as. The archaeological argument and the oral history argument are not in competition. They have been pointing at the same conclusion from different directions for decades. In 2024, oil and gas operations in the broader San Juan Basin continue on lands containing documented Chacoan outlier sites and road segments. The protection conversation is active. The outcome is not settled. Every barrel extracted from the San Juan Basin travels through a landscape that contains, beneath its surface, the earthen berms and graded corridors of a 300-year pilgrimage network. A network built by people whose descendants are still here, still asking for the roads to be treated as what they have always been. Not archaeological curiosities, not infrastructure of a lost civilization, sacred paths that connect living people to ancestral ones. The scale of what was built here, 400 miles, 30 communities, 8 cardinal road corridors, 300 years of institutional maintenance belongs in the same conversation as the pyramids, as the Roman road network, as the Grand Canal of China. It is not in that conversation in most public education. The gap between what this system represents and how widely it is known is itself a form of historical argument, an argument by omission. The argument says, the sophisticated, cosmologically organized, multi-century infrastructure of the ancestral Puebloans is a regional footnote rather than a global story. The evidence says otherwise. 850 CE to 1150 CE, 300 years of road construction across the desert without a single wheel, without a single draft animal, achieving directional precision that colonial engineers with iron tools and surveying instruments consistently failed to match. 30-foot wide processional corridors bordered by earthen berms and masonry curbing, radiating from a single canyon in cardinal directions, maintained across a geographic footprint the size of Ohio. Roads that were built to end at cliff edges because the cliff edge was the point. Roads that were cut through ridgelines in wide staircases rather than routed around them because the bearing was the point. Roads that the descendants of their builders have never stopped knowing, never stopped walking in ceremony, never stopped describing in oral histories that have been available to anyone willing to listen. The roads were not hidden. The roads were not mysterious. The roads were not lost. The understanding of them was lost, but only by people who were not asking the right questions of the right people. And when researchers finally did ask in the consultation rooms of the National Park Service, in the collaborative fieldwork of T.J. Ferguson and John Roney with Pueblo scholars, the answer had been waiting the entire time. Here is what the Chacoan road system actually is, stated plainly. A 300-year argument, made in stone and earth, about the relationship between human movement and cosmic order. That argument covers 400 miles of desert. It deviates less than 1 degree over 35 miles of its most studied segment. It cuts stairs through sandstone cliffs rather than walk around them. It ends at cliff edges rather than turn away from them. It was built by people without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, and it achieved a directional precision that the colonial engineers who came 800 years later could not replicate. It is maintained in oral history by the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Dene, and the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico, whose relationship to this landscape is legally recognized and actively contested in federal policy right now. And it was visible from space in 1978, in the Landsat data, waiting for someone to ask why the lines did not bend. The answer to that question, why the lines do not bend, is the answer to a much larger question about what civilization looks like when it is organized around meaning rather than efficiency. If this story changed how you understand what was built in North America before European contact, the most useful thing you can do is follow the sources in the description. Lexon's History of the Ancient Southwest, Roney's Road Survey documentation, the Solstice Project's published research, and seek out the voices of the Pueblo scholars and Dene advocates who have been making this argument longer than any academic publication on the subject. The roads are still there. The LiDAR data is still being analyzed. New segments are still being documented. And the people whose ancestors built them are still walking them, in ceremony, along bearings that have not changed in 1,000 years. Every road ever built bends around the mountain. These ones cut through it because some destinations are worth the straight line. If this story changed how you understand what was built in North America before European contact, the most useful thing you can do is follow the sources in the description. Lexon's History of the Ancient Southwest, Roney's Road Survey documentation, the Solstice Project's published research, and seek out the voices of the Pueblo scholars and Dene advocates who have been making this argument longer than any academic publication on the subject. The roads are still there. The LiDAR data is still being analyzed. New segments are still being documented. And the people whose ancestors built them are still walking them, in ceremony, along bearings that have not changed in 1,000 years. Every road ever built bends around the mountain. These ones cut through it because some destinations are worth the straight line.